The story of the Vietnam War does not begin on a battlefield. It is a story deeply rooted in the struggle for independence, a struggle that began long before the first American boots touched Vietnamese soil. Vietnam, a land of vibrant culture and resilient people, had endured the yoke of foreign rule for centuries.
The latter half of the 19th century saw the French tightening their grip, establishing French Indochina and imposing their will on the Vietnamese people. This colonial domination, marked by economic exploitation and cultural suppression, sowed the seeds of resentment and ignited the flames of resistance.
The Vietnamese people, yearning for self-determination, found their voice in the echoes of rebellion. They launched uprisings, each one a testament to their unwavering spirit. However, the French, determined to maintain their colonial stronghold, responded with force, quelling these uprisings with brutal efficiency.
The desire for freedom, however, is not easily extinguished. It was from these embers of resistance that a leader would emerge, a man who would come to embody Vietnam's aspirations for independence. His name was Ho Chi Minh, and his story is inseparable from the story of Vietnam itself. Ho Chi Minh's return to Vietnam marked a turning point in the country's struggle for independence. His arrival was not just a homecoming, it was a beacon of hope for millions who had long suffered under colonial rule. The streets were filled with anticipation and excitement as people gathered to catch a glimpse of the man who promised to change their destiny. He possessed a unique blend of charisma, intellect, and unwavering determination that resonated deeply with the Vietnamese people. His speeches were electrifying, his presence commanding. He spoke in a way that made each person feel seen and heard, igniting a sense of unity and purpose that transcended social and economic divides. His message was simple, yet powerful. Vietnam belonged to the Vietnamese. This resonated deeply in a country that had been under foreign domination for decades. His words were not just rhetoric, they were a call to action, a rallying cry that inspired a nation to rise and reclaim its sovereignty.
He rallied the masses, uniting peasants and intellectuals, farmers and workers, under the banner of national liberation. His ability to bridge the gap between different social classes was unprecedented. He understood that true independence could only be achieved through the collective effort of all Vietnamese people, regardless of their background.
In 1941, amidst the chaos of World War II, Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalist and communist forces united in their goal of expelling the French and establishing an independent Vietnam. This coalition was a testament to his strategic acumen, as he recognized the need for a united front to combat the well-armed and well-funded colonial forces. The Viet Minh, operating as a guerrilla force, became a formidable adversary. They employed unconventional tactics, using the dense jungles and rugged terrain to their advantage. Their knowledge of the local environment allowed them to launch surprise attacks and then disappear into the landscape, making it difficult for the French forces to gain any lasting foothold. They knew the terrain, they had the support of the people, and they were driven by an unyielding belief in their cause. The local population provided crucial support, offering food, shelter, and intelligence. This symbiotic relationship between the Viet Minh and the civilians was a key factor in their sustained resistance. The French, weakened by World War II, found themselves increasingly bogged down in a protracted and bloody conflict. Their traditional military strategies were ill-suited to the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Viet Minh. As the war dragged on, the French forces became demoralized and war-weary, struggling to maintain control over a population that was growing more defiant by the day. The war raged on, but the tide was slowly turning. The resilience and tenacity of the Viet Minh began to wear down the French forces. Each battle, each skirmish, brought them closer to their ultimate goal of independence. The determination of the Vietnamese people was unwavering, and their sacrifices were immense. The Viet Minh's victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 signaled a turning point, effectively ending French colonial rule in Vietnam. This decisive battle showcased the strategic brilliance of the Viet Minh and the indomitable spirit of the Vietnamese people. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was not just a military victory, it was a symbolic triumph that galvanized the entire nation.
The Geneva Accords of 1954, which formally recognized Vietnamese independence, seemed to promise a new era of peace and self-determination. The accords were a diplomatic victory, acknowledging the legitimacy of the Vietnamese struggle for independence. However, the path to lasting peace was fraught with challenges. The agreement also stipulated the temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's communist forces in control of the north and a U.S.-supported government in the south. This division sowed the seeds for future conflict, as the ideological divide between the north and south would eventually lead to a protracted and devastating civil war. The dream of a unified, independent Vietnam was still far from being realized, but Ho Chi Minh's legacy as a champion of Vietnamese independence remained unshaken. The post-World War II era saw the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in an ideological struggle that came to be known as the Cold War. This period was marked by intense political, military, and economic competition, as both nations sought to expand their influence across the globe. The Cold War was not just a battle of arms, but also a battle of ideas, with capitalism and democracy on one side, and communism and authoritarianism on the other. This rivalry, fueled by deep-seated mistrust and competing visions for the future, extended its reach far beyond the borders of these two nations, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the globe. The Cold War's influence was felt in every corner of the world, from Europe to Asia, Africa to Latin America. Nations were often forced to choose sides, aligning themselves with either the US-led Western Bloc or the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc.
Vietnam, newly independent but deeply divided, found itself caught in the crosshairs of this global power struggle. After gaining independence from French colonial rule, Vietnam was split into two: the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-Communist South, under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. This division set the stage for a prolonged and bloody conflict, as both sides vied for control of the entire country.
The United States, fearing the spread of communism, viewed Vietnam through the lens of the Domino theory. This theory suggested that the fall of one nation to communism would trigger a chain reaction, leading to the spread of communism throughout the region. American policymakers believed that if Vietnam fell, neighboring countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even Indonesia could soon follow. This theory, which gained prominence in American foreign policy circles, became a central tenet of U.S. foreign policy, justifying American intervention in various parts of the world to contain the spread of communism. It was a strategy rooted in the belief that the survival of free nations depended on stopping the advance of communist influence.
Driven by this fear, the U.S. began to provide increasing support to the government in South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. American aid came in various forms, including financial assistance, military equipment, and advisory support. The goal was to strengthen the South Vietnamese government and military, enabling them to resist the communist insurgency and maintain control over the southern part of the country. Diem, however, proved to be an unpopular and autocratic leader, alienating many in South Vietnam and fueling the flames of discontent. His repressive policies, corruption, and favoritism towards the Catholic minority led to widespread dissatisfaction among the predominantly Buddhist population. Protests and uprisings became increasingly common, further destabilizing the already fragile situation in South Vietnam.
As Diem's grip on power weakened, the communist insurgency in the south, supported by the North Vietnamese government, gained momentum. The Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force, intensified their attacks on South Vietnamese targets, aiming to overthrow Diem's regime and reunify the country under communist rule. The North Vietnamese army also provided significant support, sending troops and supplies to aid the insurgents. As the situation deteriorated, the U.S. began to commit more resources and personnel to the fight, hoping to prevent a communist takeover. What began as a modest deployment of military advisors gradually escalated into a full-blown military intervention. By the mid-1960s, tens of thousands of American troops were on the ground in Vietnam, engaged in combat operations against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. The conflict, which had once seemed distant and manageable, was now consuming significant American resources and attention.
The Vietnam War, once a distant conflict, was about to become a defining chapter in American history. It would test the limits of American resolve, challenge the nation's ideals, and leave a lasting impact on both Vietnam and the United States. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 proved to be a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, marking a significant escalation of U.S. involvement in the conflict. This incident is often cited as the catalyst that transformed the Vietnam War from a regional conflict into a full-scale war involving the United States. The incident involved two alleged attacks on U.S. Navy destroyers by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. These attacks were reported to have occurred on August 2nd and 4th, creating a sense of urgency and threat.
Later investigation revealed that the second attack never happened.
The incident provided the Johnson administration with the pretext it needed to secure congressional authorization for a broader military campaign in Vietnam. This was a crucial turning point, as it allowed the U.S. to justify increased military action. With this newfound authority, the Johnson administration was able to significantly ramp up military operations in Vietnam and embarked on a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, which aimed to weaken the North Vietnamese war effort and force them to negotiate. The U.S. began deploying ground troops in larger numbers. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, characterized by intense combat and significant U.S. military presence. The United States was now fully engaged in the Vietnam War, committing vast resources and personnel to the conflict. The escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam had profound consequences, both domestically and internationally. The war's impact was felt far beyond the battlefields of Southeast Asia. At home, it led to deep divisions within American society, fueling the anti-war movement and creating a climate of dissent and protest, and sparking protests across the country. These protests were often led by students, civil rights activists, and other groups who opposed the war on moral and political grounds. Internationally, it heightened Cold War tensions, as the U.S. and its allies faced off against communist forces supported by the Soviet Union and China, and drew condemnation from many countries, including some of America's closest allies. The war strained diplomatic relations and led to widespread criticism of U.S. foreign policy.
The Vietnam War was no longer just a conflict in Southeast Asia. It had become a global issue that was influencing international relations and domestic politics in profound ways. The Paris Peace Accords marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. Signed in January 1973, the accords aimed to establish peace in Vietnam and end the conflict between North and South Vietnam. These negotiations were a complex and arduous process, involving multiple rounds of talks and a wide array of international actors. The accords were seen as a diplomatic effort to bring an end to nearly 2 decades of conflict.
The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of prisoners of war. It also included provisions for the peaceful reunification of Vietnam through democratic elections. However, despite the signing of the accords, the reality on the ground remained grim. Both sides accused each other of violations, and the fighting continued. The ceasefire was fragile at best, and the envisioned peace seemed increasingly elusive.
The withdrawal of U.S. troops marked the end of direct American military involvement in Vietnam, but it did not mean the end of the war. The South Vietnamese government, heavily dependent on U.S. support, struggled to fend off the North Vietnamese forces. The U.S. continued to provide financial and military aid to South Vietnam, but without American troops on the ground, the balance of power began to shift. In the years following the Paris Peace Accords, the situation in Vietnam deteriorated rapidly. The North Vietnamese launched a series of offensives, gradually gaining ground. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The city was quickly captured, and the South Vietnamese government surrendered unconditionally. The fall of Saigon was a dramatic and chaotic event, symbolizing the final collapse of South Vietnam and the reunification of the country under communist rule.
The Vietnam War, which had claimed millions of lives and left deep scars on both Vietnamese and American societies, had finally come to an end. The consequences of the war would continue to reverberate for years to come, shaping the political and social landscapes of both nations. North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, leading to the unification of Vietnam under communist control. This event sent shockwaves through the region and the world, marking a significant geopolitical shift.
The immediate aftermath saw a mass exodus of South Vietnamese citizens, fearing retribution from the new regime. Thousands fled by boat, leading to the humanitarian crisis known as the Vietnamese boat people. Many sought asylum in countries like the United States, Australia, and Canada, forever altering the demographic landscapes of these nations.
Inside Vietnam, the new government embarked on a campaign of re-education, aiming to consolidate its control. Former South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and intellectuals were sent to re-education camps, where they faced harsh conditions and indoctrination. The country faced significant economic challenges, exacerbated by years of war, and the imposition of a centrally planned economy. The war also had profound effects on American veterans, many of whom struggled with physical and psychological wounds long after the fighting had ended.
Decades later, the Vietnam War remains a poignant reminder of the complexities and costs of conflict. It serves as a lesson in the limitations of military power and the importance of understanding the cultural and political landscapes of foreign nations. The war's legacy continues to shape international relations, influencing how nations approach issues of war, peace, and diplomacy.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.